Hello and welcome to this short tutorial where I'm going to be going through how I created this piece that you can see on screen, with keeping in mind of the importance of just trusting the process. What I mean by this is when I go to start a piece of art, I normally have this idea in my head I get really excited about, and I start to ask myself loads of questions to figure out what this world's going to look like. What era is it set in? What fantasy element is going to have in it? What is the character doing? What world is this taking place in? Loads of different questions to try and come up with an interesting story or something that could make a really good piece of art. Sometimes this holds me back, and I'm sure, like many of other artists out there, I have a folder of stuff that is just unfinished work because me overthinking stuff leads to the process of you doubting whether the idea is good enough or whether it could work. So this video is all about just trusting the process, and this is exactly what I did with this piece. Had an initial idea and then just ran with it and kind of made things up as I went along. Not to say this is the right way, but it was a very good practice to stop you getting into that mindset of overthinking things and not actually creating. Keeping that in mind, for this piece I just gave myself a very simple set of rules, or a tiny brief. That being that I knew I wanted to create a building as being the main focus of this piece of artwork. I wanted it to be an old kind of stone ruin, either a castle or a tower. And then I wanted to have some weird shack that was sort of bolted onto it, or some extra like old tech elements. And that was the only rules that I set myself for this. And the rest of it was kind of just figuring it out as I went along. So here's the 4 initial sketches that I did. Just coming up with different ideas. I went mainly with just sort of side-on views just to try and get that nice like shape language and what sort of different things could be bolted onto these towers, or what tech elements could be popping out of a barn and so on. So that's where I started. Even with this more organic approach to creating stuff up as you go along, it's very good to have reference, because some stuff grounded in reality is always going to look more believable at the end. So I gathered a few pieces that fit in with the theme of what I was going for. Just looking at some old fishing shacks, some stone towers, old barns, and then some inspiration of other artists' work that I like the mood of that I could bring into this piece. But in general, it was just a broad sort of stroke of a collection of things that I liked and could help feed the idea of where this was going. Naturally, after looking at the reference and then pondering over my 4 sketches that I'd done initially, I leant more towards one in particular. I took that sketch, then I just fleshed it out further. At this stage, there was lots of ideas chucking around in my head, and sort of the idea that this old stone structure that was some old lighthouse years ago had been built upon over the years by different peoples who've got this sort of fisherman's shack that was attached to the front, and then this sort of dock that was been patched up over the years. And then this is kind of the idea that it's set in this futuristic fantasy world where we've got these tech that has been used, the sort of signal boost that's been attached to the top, that is then hooked up to this area at the top of the tower, which could have some sort of generator of some sort inside it. So the next part of the process for me is taking the sketch and then going into 3D, particularly using Blender, and just mocking up the sketch that I've created into a 3D scene, just so I got an idea of what it's going to be like in a 3D space. For me, I find working in 3D just so much more free than it is just sketching on a flat canvas, because you can really explore things from different angles, add in different assets, how are things going to be connected together to make them seem a bit more realistic. It's just an amazing tool. I use a mix of own models, some free textures, and free assets from various different places. Like you see the dock element, that's a free asset. Obviously the cone on top there's a simple shape, and very basic modeling going on here, just to give a simple sort of 3D mock-up of the scene. You can obviously take this a lot further, and sometimes I do go quite heavy on the 3D side of it just because I really enjoy it and get carried away with all the details. But for this instance, I kind of kept it as simple as what you can see now, because I knew I was going to change this a lot in Photoshop and paint over it later. Turning on the textures, you can see The detail of some of these is quite high with these free assets, which is always great because it kind of gives you a step forward when it comes to the painting process or editing in Photoshop. You've already got some of that really nice details there. But don't feel like you have to add loads of details. It's kind of whatever you're more comfortable with, you know, whether it's you enjoy 3D more or you enjoy doing painting more, it's kind of entirely up to you. So the next part in my process was taking the render into Photoshop and then getting to work and doing loads of digital painting to fill out the details. I really wanted to focus on doing at least half of the work, digital painting or sketching in this one, just because I hadn't done it in a while and I'd been focused more on using photo textures or 3D to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So I feel like I was a bit rusty with the digital painting, so that's why I focused a bit more on that this time round. At this stage, I knew what I wanted the tower to look like. I had some ideas in my head for the details that could be added, so yeah, I got to work and just started painting in all of those details. To stop myself getting too bogged down in painting little details, periodically through the painting I stop and I just highlight to myself where things are going to be, like details, the trees, the extra elements that are going to be added in, just so there's some sort of structure as I'm going along, so I know where to focus attention and where I can not worry about things until later on down the line. With the intention of improving my digital painting techniques, I then moved on to tackling the trees to the left hand side and the sort of grass and foliage areas. Man, I forgot how difficult it is to paint trees and grass, but it was a very good experience of studying trees again and learning how it could fit into this particular environment and add hopefully some sort of mood and character to it by the end piece. I tried to keep it similar sort of tones and colours to the rest of the sort of structure in the middle, just to make it feel like it belonged. Kind of using the 3D render colours from that as a point that I kept colour picking from. When trying to improve on digital painting skills, I find it super useful to try and keep things limited just to one or two layers. As you can see on the right hand side, I kind of just stuck to one layer and just kept painting on top of each other. It just removes the process of trying to add different layers and overlay effects and so on. Back to more the traditional way of painting where if you make a mistake, you've got to paint in something else to fix that mistake. Another great benefit if you do use 3D in your process is the lighting. You've already got a lighting base there that you have chosen that's casting these shadows that you can then add to. As you can see here, I added extra sort of thin slivers of light that could be shining through from the boards above. This obviously wasn't there in the 3D because the boards are too close to each other, but in the painting process afterwards in Photoshop, you can easily add these details in, and using the tonal values of the light that's already hitting the rock, you can quite easily add those things in at a later date. And it's super helpful using that as reference as you're kind of adding these extra details in. At this point, if you're watching it and you're thinking, oh, how do you come up with all those details and figure out how things are going to look? On the side of doing this, I always have reference up when I'm working. So just keep referring back to the reference and have a little look at all these details of, how does the paint weather on the side of a particular building like this by the coast? Where does it peel? How much grunge has it got on it? What different colors has it got in the paint and so on? Looking at reference and just studying things and sitting back and taking time to do that can be so valuable when it comes to actually painting them in, almost to a point where you don't really have to think about it. You kind of it almost feels like you're discovering it as you're painting it, if it makes any sense. But yeah, always look at reference. It is super helpful. After getting stuck in and painting some details, I took a step back and had a look at elements that I felt could be improved on. And I was coming up with ideas for the sky, and then I thought, why don't we have the sky a bit more interesting? So I was like trying to play around with different cloud structures. And then there was a point where I just had this idea along the way of having the clouds kind of, the formations form around this tower in like kind of a ring or a circular sort of fashion. So it was, as I was going along, I was coming up with these story elements. I think purely because of me just doing a different process, not trying to figure out everything to begin with and just doing stuff on the fly. So that's where that idea came from. And it developed further into the idea that this sort of radio beacon tower thing that was on top of the fisherman's shack could be something to do with, the formation of how these clouds are forming around it, which then developed into further elements that I added in later on to kind of try and bring some sort of story into it. This then led into the next phase, which for me was adding even more storytelling elements into this. So I went in with just a blue colour just to sketch in some ideas of these different props that kind of bring it more to life and help tell this story of this old fisherman's shack that someone had been living in whilst they'd been trying to fix up this radio weather beacon thing. And then this character would be arriving at the dock and just exploring this world and coming across it because he followed this signal to this place. And that's kind of the moment that you're seeing in the final piece, is just arriving and starting to investigate what is going on. So here is just sketching out loads of different props and ideas of what might be located around an old fisherman's shack like this. Again, looking at reference and just having fun with it and just making things up and just coming up with cool ideas, designing different assets and props that could be placed around it. A little tip that I found super useful for painting props and details is start with the mid-tone of that particular object first, then add on the highlight color, and then any extra details of the super bright highlights, or in this case the shadow. Obviously there's loads of different ways to paint, but I find this being a super handy way of getting stuff that looks fairly realistic, or at least grounded in the environment that you're painting stuff in quite quickly, which is always really rewarding when you're doing it, because you can feel like you're heading in the right direction rather than just painting in random shapes and hoping for the best. So the final step that I do to most of my images, which I haven't shown here because I forgot to record it, but is to adjust the colors of the whole image. So I flatten this down, run it through Camera Raw filter, and just play around with the different tones, add some grain effects, maybe clean up some bits and pieces, just to do that extra level of tweaking to get it to a mood where I'm quite happy with it. So there it is, an insight into my process I went through to creating this piece. Hopefully this was somewhat useful and you've learned something from it, but overall the whole message of just trusting the process, don't let yourself get in the way of creating something, just trust in it, and those times where you doubt yourself and you want to give up on it, just keep going and you'll learn stuff along the way and improve with each piece that you create.